Alright YouTube, time for the next video. This is sort of dedicated to my friend Hans, who is interested in Judaism, Judaistic mysticism, and the video topic was going to be Kabbalah, but I decided to just make it about Jewish mysticism in a general sense. There are so many, you wouldn't believe how complicated it is when you begin reading the material. It's not like Gnostic tradition or the opinions of certain types of Christians or something like that insofar as their esoteric materials go. It's a lot more complex than that. Judaism has been around a long time, and there are legalistic elements within Judaism just as there are mystic elements, and so you have a great deal of material to sort of sift through to really get a clue what's going on. As far as Jewish mysticism goes, one of the main elements behind it within Kabbalah is the 10 Sephiroth, whichever way you choose to pronounce it, I suppose. You know, the Yesod and the Chokmah and things like that, the Keter. The 10 emanations, basically, of the sort of highest light, the highest godly, divine, cosmic source. It has some parallels with Gnosticism. If you read the Sefer Bahir, I believe it was, or maybe it was the Sefer Yetzirah, it was one of those two texts. It appears to have some Gnostic inclusions within it. And you do have these sort of similarities between some of these systems over time. This isn't just the case with Jewish mysticism or with Gnosis, the Hermetics, Thelema, Satanism, any of these sort of mystic or kind of mystic paths that you can think of as being involved with the spiritual. There are areas of overlap, and sometimes they produce hybrids. With Jewish mysticism in sort of the modern age, one of the things that's been done is an attempt by some dark magicians to sort of invert the entire system. Instead of having the 10 emanations, thus of the deity, if you invert them and do the opposite, the idea is to get further away from the control of this same divine cosmic source. And by the way, there are Jewish scribes who think Kabbalah is actually pretty dangerous and that you probably shouldn't attempt to ascend up to the Ein Sof of their deity Yahweh, because you'll get basically burned up into absolute nothingness. You will lose the very essence of your being because you're incapable of actually dealing with being that close to your deity. You would get assimilated. It would be almost Borg-like. There are those who would seek not to ascend that far. They'd be worried about falling back to earth and dying like Sisyphus at that point. Another constant theme within Jewish mysticism, numbers and letters. As with certain other philosophical texts from the Renaissance and before, and including in the Enlightenment period, where you've got to realize a lot of people in society at the time were utterly ignorant of math, often illiterate. They couldn't, read a grimoire if they actually encountered one anyway. And so you have a fixation upon what we would consider classical education, reading, writing, and arithmetic, astronomy, and things like that. In some cases, you don't even have pictures to go along with them. I guess they were worried that the illiterate peasant who stumbled upon their hoard of books would actually know what they contained and rat them out to the secular authorities or the church fathers or something, and they'd get put in the guillotine, or have to sit in the stocks for a couple weeks, having people throw rotten cabbages at them or something. What you end up having is a situation where a large number of these texts involved with mystic Judaism, again, the Bahir, the Yetzirah, any of these things, they fixate upon language. For instance, the concept that the Hebrew letters represent, mathematically speaking, divine concepts, the three mothers and the seven foundations and things like that, that are based upon these letters, and often words are broken down into their characters and given a meaning thereupon, depending on what characters were used, the word usage, the similarity of one word to another, and so forth. This is similar, by the way, to some of these Norse systems, or the Finnish language that you would get from something like the Bach Saga. That's essentially exactly what Lord Bach was talking about himself, which I thought was rather strange. You have these similarities between Jewish mysticism and other types many times. Anyone who wants to learn about it, read the Zohar. read the Sefer Bahir, the Sefer Yetzirah, the Sefer Raziel. The Yetzirah, I believe, was the most prominent work within sort of this mystic tradition before the Zohar even existed, and largely was thereupon assimilated into the works of the Zohar, which is much longer, I believe, as well. I think the Zohar is like a magnum opus, massive, novel-sized work, as opposed to some of these shorter materials that are really, they're more what you would get from an antiquated or medieval era manuscript, something, that was written on vellum and in an illuminated manuscript 1,000 years ago or something like that. The works tended to be, in some cases, quite a bit shorter. You've got these philosophical works, even when you look at grimoires that don't mention Judaism or even the Christian God necessarily. Oftentimes what you find are similarities which lead me to conclude, this is the case with the Red Dragon, the Grand Grimoire, they lead me to conclude that the person writing them or the people writing them had a familiarity with Jewish mysticism as well. Another thing is Gematria, the concept of numbering names. We see this in Revelation, pointed out on my last video, that the Bible's book of Revelation, which is heretical to a Jew, they don't believe in the New Testament works, really. They would regard Jesus as a wise man or a prophet, maybe, but they wouldn't regard him as the Messiah or the Son of God. They're still waiting for their Moshiach, their Messiah. To them, Revelation's use of the number 666 is straight out of Jewish mysticism. It's simply a thinly veiled, coded way of identifying who the Antichrist is that it is talking about. The literal Antichrist being someone who's just the opposite of being Christ-like, someone very legalistic instead of very sort of wandering around like a hermit, someone who's rich and legalistic and very concerned with religious authority as opposed to doing the right thing. That would be the Antichrist. Seems to be a statement upon the government of Rome, probably Nero Caesar. Can't necessarily know for sure. I've heard at least one person say that it was some other emperor, and I can't remember the friggin' name of the emperor right now. But it's possible. Doesn't really matter. The point is the same. The numbers that are given. And 616 is also given, which is retarded. It's revisionism, really, when you think about it, because the Gospel of Judas, I believe, that they talk about in this, I believe that was probably just a misprint within the context of that text itself. We have Bibles from the early period and they say 666, even the ones before all the mistranslations they've done lately. That's straight out of Jewish mysticism. And within Judaism, you have to understand, of course, there are so many different types of Jews. There are Jews that are not particularly religious, then there are those that are. Those that are religious, they can be very legalistic, concerned with sort of the religious authority, the ritualism and so forth, making sure that's all proper and literally kosher. Those that are more mystic in their traditions. You have all of these little, you've also got, in the modern era, you've also got Messianic Jews. People who identify as Jews, follow Jewish tradition, but also believe in and venerate Jesus Christ as the literal Moshiach that the Jews were waiting for. Although they're not a particularly large movement, they do exist. There's a bunch of them that live here and own a restaurant right in Rutland, which has the tastiest fucking food around. So I'll eat there anytime. If I have the money to eat out, I'm going to the Yellow Deli, because their hot dogs and veggie burgers and everything else are absolutely stellar. They make smoothies too, which is pretty tasty. It's all organic, non-GMO, heirloom varieties. They grow all the stuff themselves that they process. I mean, it's really quite astounding. The only thing that's not organic is the ketchup. Really, they use Heinz. That's the only thing that they add for the benefit of the tourists who they don't want their veggie burger plain, I guess. But as far as Jewish mysticism goes, it can be extremely daunting considering the amount of literature involved, the number of different opinions involved. And this roughly resembles certain other religious movements. You don't necessarily have this problem in some really small group, which may or may not even be extant anymore. For instance, again, the Gnostics. They were never a massive religious order. They still exist today, not in large numbers. The amount of new Gnostic literature is perhaps not particularly vast. The amount of literature from the antiquated period pales in comparison to the sort of materials you get from other Christian groups. And therefore, because of the smaller corpus of literature, it's easier to understand, and it's less broken apart into different sects, different subgroups that believe different things or have differing opinions about things. Christianity and Judaism and Islam are not that way. They are broken down into unnumberable numbers of little tiny groups and little cliques, and sometimes even like tribal or regional or even, you know, neighborhood based groups that believe something totally different. You might have one specific town out in the Midwest somewhere where there's a new Christian order that believes something totally different. That's how Mormonism starts. It's exactly the same thing with Jewish mysticism. There are so many different opinions. The rabbis, the scholars that interpret these materials may come to vastly different conclusions, issue their own manuscripts regarding other manuscripts, and then you just have this ever-increasing core that's already large and gets larger, you know, by the year, of literature. You also have those who are literally regarded as seers or as prophets or something like that within the mystic community of Judaism. And so Judaism is prone to suddenly grow a splinter group based on some prophecy that's been made, some sort of calculation within their mystic system. Something happens and a group forms around that happening. And it continues to almost cannibalize itself in many ways. Judaism is far smaller, you'll note, than Christianity or Islam. Part of the reason why I think this is, other than, you know, Christians and Muslims were always trying to convert by fire and sword. The Jews, if they tolerated people converting to them at all, they tried to discourage them from becoming Jews, and if they were very persistent, then they'd say, okay, we'll teach you Judaism. It did not go out of its way, generally speaking, to win converts. I'm still surprised at the story of Khazaria. The Khazarian king, of course, had Christians, Muslims, Jews, and so forth come to him and try to convince him he wanted one religion in his kingdom. And they all came and spoke to him about their religious systems, and he chose Judaism. It's actually slightly strange to me that the people representing Judaism did not apparently tell him, oh, you probably shouldn't become a Jew, and I think they're supposed to sort of deny the person and tell them not to become a Jew several times before they admit them into sort of learning about Judaism. Now, I'm not Judaistic. I view Judaism as basically undifferentiated from Christianity and Islam. They're all parts of the same Abrahamic family. The Mormonism is the same. The Gnostics are kind of, I don't know exactly how you define Gnostics. Philosophically, they're almost closer to certain pagan groups. They really take sort of a pagan view of philosophy and apply it to that Christian body of literature and made their own literature. But Judaism is extremely interesting in its mystic traditions, at least, insofar as a person is capable of understanding them. You've got to realize that the literature is available, but interpreting it, because of the legalistic tradition within elements of Judaism, really requires the opinions of their various scholars, who in some cases you'll have somebody who has spent 50, 60 years, basically their entire life, just studying Jewish material, not just the Torah, which they regard as their sacred work, the sacred book of their Lord Yahweh. Not just that, like the Christians would have a Bible, but imagine that the Christian wasn't just, you know, sort of told to read the Bible. They also had several thousand other works and tens of thousands of opinion pieces written about them that they were supposed to peruse constantly, day in and day out, and consider it a blessing to do so. Most Christians probably would not have the wherewithal to do so. I've criticized Christianity and said most of them have only read one book, or one compendium of shorter works, basically, which is what the Bible is. The Torah materials, the Old Testament, it's right in there. Simply, the Torah would not have, the revelation of St. John, the epistle of not the epistles of Peter. Well, yeah, I think those are New Testament too. The letters of Paul and stuff like that would be left out. But understanding the 10 sort of essences, the emanations of Ein Sof, the Sephirot, those 10 emanations, that's basically the central principle behind a great deal of this material. You would have to learn a great deal about numbering systems, letters, geometry is involved. Basically, everything is involved with the study of Kabbalah. You would have to do a great deal of side research, probably, in order to understand any large amount of it. I've only scratched the surface. To me, it's almost too arcane and confusing to really delve that deep. I've read and made editions of the Sefer Yetzirah, the Sefer Bahir, read pieces of the Zohar and so forth, and obviously I've read what they would consider the Torah because former Christian, read the Bible cover to cover, Old and New Testament, so I've read those materials, although perhaps a less reliable translation insofar as the Old Testament goes, if you're using like the KJV. KJV, that is. I got criticized for saying KGV. It just flows on the tongue more easily. Sorry about that. Can't help it. I'm a Vermonter. I've got a little bit of an accent. I understand that. Jewish mysticism is interesting. As for would I dedicate a great deal of time studying it, honestly, I'm really more interested in Gnosticism. I think Gnosticism is probably the most interesting esoteric tradition that I've encountered, other than paganism or stuff that you would think of, dark, witchcraft, stuff like that, some leather-bound grimoire that's literally all about destroying things. That's pretty exciting and cool, and Gnosis, I think, is probably the most philosophically insightful system that I've read about, that I've studied to any great deal. Zoroastrianism is cool. That's cool too. Judaism, mystic Judaism, is extremely dense. You would do they would be long hours studying for long days in long years before you had more than a basic grasp of the material. You can learn the basics in a single day, but once you begin delving into the material, it's far more dense. Even the numbering systems alone, there's more than one numbering system. You can't even really tell which numbering system you're supposed to be using. You'd have to know the date and sort of the background of whoever wrote or edited it, and then compare it to whatever system was most likely to be used at the time. Otherwise, you're going to mistranslate everything it's saying and you'll gain absolutely nothing. That is a persistent problem within mystic Judaism. So it's an interesting path, but a confusing one, basically. That's about all. Peace out.